In this lecture, I'm going to talk about gentrification. According to Oxford Languages, the term describes a process whereby the character of a poor urban area is changed by wealthier people moving in, improving housing and attracting new businesses, often displacing current inhabitants in the process. In other words, gentrification refers to a process of social recomposition of the neighborhoods, often centrally located. Over a relatively short period of time, in some cases only a few years, the neighborhood changes. This is, for example, the case in Denver, London, Paris, among many other cities, where residents are gradually replaced by new and frequently better-off citizens. In Rio de Janeiro, Vidigal neighborhood, a favela settlement in the southern part of the city, has a beautiful view over the Ipanema beach. The settlement is now changing. The residents are moving away to the suburbs as prices increase. Luxury houses and hotels are now appearing in the landscapes. Places improve, but not always to the benefit of the residents, as the low and moderate income residents may be unable to pay the rent and will have to move. Gentrification has health impacts for those who are forced to move. For them, the process can lead to mental health issues, to a loss in access to healthcare services, to a loss of local support, to a shift in previous healthy habits. Older people, migrants, socially vulnerable, low-income groups, single people and single-parent families without support are most often affected. For instance, according to the US National Community Reinvestment Coalition, displacement of Black and Hispanic residents impacted at least 135,000 people between 2000 and 2013. In Washington, D.C., 20,000 Black residents were displaced. And in many cases, they have to move to the city outskirts, with worse access to jobs, services and support. Over the past 3 decades, researchers have debated the root causes of this phenomenon. Some say that gentrification is the result of the evolving preferences of people. Young adults increasingly value central areas and their vibrant life full of bars and restaurants, music, culture. Other researchers highlight the role of uncontrolled dynamics of the real estate market and speculation leading to high prices on houses and rents. Public policies also play a role in reinforcing this process. As cities compete with each other with the aim of attracting capital and wealthier residents, they support urban regeneration interventions and the improvement of public spaces and local living conditions. Another trend is related to touristification.
É o que eles querem aqui. E querem que eu vá embora, que é para arranjar esta casa para os turistas. E não vou, né? Daqui não saio. Vieram aqui do sítio, aqui nesta zona, mas eles não dão, eles querem que me vá daqui embora, a força toda. Eu vim para aqui morar há 58 anos. Tive 4 anos solteira, depois que assim vim para aqui. Tenho que subir e descer todos os dias, mas é que tenho mesmo que subir e descer. Quando não posso subir de uma maneira, tenho que subir de outra. O teto daquele quarto lá da frente, um pequenino, também está tudo a cair. Aquilo está mesmo miserável. As janelas estão a cair e eles não querem fazer nada. Mas gosto de estar aqui neste bairro. Ele puseram uma casa em Alcântara. Puseram aí. Mas eu não quis ir. Há uma que o ambiente é muito mau. E a outra também já estava habituada aqui e não ia.
A recent study found that 189 European cities exceed 1,000 active listings during summer peak. Cities like Sevilla in Spain have undergone a 9% increase in overnight stays each year since 2014. And in Alfama neighborhood, Lisbon, almost 50% of the apartments were devoted to short stays before the COVID-19 crisis. A consequence is that the population is replaced by a succession of very short-lived residents. How does that affect the former residents? Let's listen to Luís Mendes, a geographer, researcher and activist.
Lisbon is experiencing a peak of international projection as a tourist destination. At the same time, its housing market acquires financial asset format and attracts global dynamics of demand and foreign investment. This process has leveraged by the government programs and the neoliberal turn in urban policy that fostered the attraction of transnational elites and favored the financialization of the housing stock and the real estate. This produced a huge urban restructuring in Lisbon. So we are now under a different process of gentrification. We call it super gentrification. This creates strong distortions in the housing market. The value of housing and rents just skyrocket, and it doubled their value in just 10 years, making it prohibitive and inaccessible for the majority of the population, even for the middle class. So since then, residents have started to suffer some kind of real estate bullying and pressure by the landlords and the real estate investment trusts to abandon their homes. So between 2016 and 2017, at least 5 families a day were evicted, intentionally degrading the building, removing the access stairs, for example, subjecting residents to a constant urban rehabilitation work, cutting electricity, gas, and water are some of the techniques used by the homeowners in the inner city to force tenants out of their houses and then applying a higher rent price to the property. Especially immigrants, elderly, and other social vulnerable groups have been hardest hit by this perfect storm. Of course, the social movements and collectives and associations fighting for the right to housing have catapulted this theme to the top of the social, media, academic, and political agenda. This put pressure on the national government, but also in the city council, to try to approve some kind of public affordable housing policies, but also to try to regulate short-term rental and the overheated housing and rental market.
Displacements can be real or symbolic. By real displacements, I refer to what I mentioned earlier on what happens when the prices rise and a resident can no longer afford to pay the rent. The resident is evicted from the dwelling because the owner, whether it's an individual or an investment fund, decides to sell or rehabilitate it. The decision or obligation to move or not depends on a number of factors, in particular household composition and income level. Symbolic displacements are different. They happen when it's not the person who moves, but the neighborhood that changes. Traditional shops gradually disappear, giving way to new coffee shops, designer stores and restaurants directed to more affluent consumers. Friends and neighbors also move away and the sense of community dies. The atmosphere of the place or its identity changes. It is an extraordinary upheaval in people's lives, even more intense among older people and socially marginalized population groups who may even struggle with health issues. When residents are pushed to the margins, disparities in health may widen. Gentrification and displacements may cause higher levels of stress and anxiety at all ages, linked to adverse health outcomes. A recent study found that gentrification appears to have a negative impact on the mental health of renters, low-income residents and long-term residents. They didn't observe this impact among homeowners, higher income residents and recent residents. The study concludes that gentrification levies mental health costs on financially vulnerable community members and can worsen mental health inequities. Another recent study conducted in California showed that living in a gentrified neighborhood was associated with increased likelihoods of serious psychological distress when compared to low-income and non-gentrified neighborhoods. Another one found that urban renewal programs that resulted in gentrification tended to have negative health effects, primarily in residents that were low income. and another one found that gentrification leads to worse health outcomes for the black population in Philadelphia. Several pathways have been identified: short-term impacts arising from a disruptive change, long-term impacts linked to limited housing choice, and also to discriminations experienced by displaced persons when looking for a new place, due to the stigma attached to their former place. For those who remain in place, adverse outcomes are the result of changing behaviors or reduced access to services, of the loss of sense of community. Gentrification may break down social cohesion in the neighborhoods. Familiarity, attachment to place, encourage people to leave their homes, to go for a walk. The loss of the usual landmarks of neighborhood relationships can lead to a more sedentary lifestyle. Research has not covered all the health effects of gentrification yet. There is still a lot to discover, even positive outcomes. In particular, gentrification doesn't always lead to displacement, and in some cases it can also be beneficial to the residents. Home ownership, breaks on property taxes for long-time residents, public housing preservation, agreements with investors are some possible ways to avoid displacements and protect people's health. This comes with an imperative. Gentrification and health are related and need to be taken into account in the planning process.